Every police department has at least one case that everyone privately agrees they got wrong the first time. Not wrong in a sense of corruption or laziness or incompetence. Wrong in the sense that the evidence, on the night it happened, pointed so clearly in one direction that no one thought to look in any other. And it was only years later, when a single piece of paper was examined by the right expert at the right time, that the entire story fell apart. This is that kind of case. On the morning of March 3rd, 1994, a woman named Evelyn Marsh was found dead in the study of her home in a quiet residential neighborhood in a mid-sized city in the American South. Beside her was a handwritten note in her own handwriting, expressing what appeared to be her own words. In her own voice, a note the police, at the time, accepted as a suicide note, closing the case within a matter of weeks. For 16 years, that was the end of the story. Then, in 2010, a forensic document examiner reviewing the file for an unrelated training exercise noticed something in the ink. Something that shouldn't have been possible if the note had been written when everyone assumed it was written. Something that suggested the note wasn't written before Evelyn Marsh died. It was written after. This is the story of the note written after death, and the 16 years it took for anyone to notice. Evelyn Marsh was 41 years old in the spring of 1994. She worked as a claims adjuster for a regional insurance company, a job she'd held for nearly 12 years. She was divorced with one adult daughter, Renata, who lived 2 states away and spoke to her mother by phone most Sundays. By every account gathered afterward, Evelyn was a private person, well-liked at work, close with a small circle of friends, but not someone who let many people in past a certain point. On the evening of March 2nd, 1994, Evelyn's next-door neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Constance Whitfield, recalled seeing the lights on in Evelyn's study until at least 11 p.m., later than usual. She noted, since Evelyn generally kept early hours, Constance didn't think much of it at the time. People stay up late sometimes. The following morning, March 3rd, Evelyn failed to show up for a 9 a.m. meeting at work, something her supervisor described as wildly out of character, since Evelyn had not missed a day of work without calling in for over a decade. By 10:30, when repeated calls to her home went unanswered, a coworker drove to the house to check on her. The coworker found the front door unlocked, also unusual, and, after calling out several times with no response, went inside and found Evelyn in her study, seated at her desk. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The initial examination pointed to a cause of death consistent with an overdose of prescription medication, several bottles of which were found on the desk beside her, along with a glass that had contained what appeared to be whiskey. And beside the bottles, in the center of the desk, was a single handwritten page, a note addressed to no one in particular that read, in part, as an expression of exhaustion, of feeling unable to continue, of not wanting anyone to blame themselves. The handwriting was compared, at the time, to samples of Evelyn's known writing, old letters, a signed lease, notes from her desk at work, and was deemed by the investigating officers, without the involvement of a trained forensic document examiner, to be a reasonable match. Given the note, the circumstances, and the absence of any sign of forced entry or struggle, the county medical examiner ruled the death a suicide within 3 weeks. The case was closed. Evelyn's daughter, Renata, never fully accepted that ruling. She would say so repeatedly in the years that followed, but with no physical evidence to support an alternative explanation, and with a note in her mother's own hand sitting in the case file, there was little she or anyone else could do but grieve and wonder, and eventually, mostly move on. For 16 years, that was where the case stayed. In 2010, The state crime laboratory serving the region conducted an internal training initiative aimed at improving forensic document examination practices across the department, a relatively routine exercise in which experienced examiners reviewed older, closed case files to identify handwriting and document analyses that had been performed without the benefit of techniques that had become standard in more recent years. It was not, in any sense, an active reinvestigation. It was closer to an audit. The examiner assigned to review the Marsh file was a woman named Dr. Priya Ambedkar, a forensic document specialist with nearly 2 decades of experience, much of it focused specifically on questioned document analysis, a subfield that examines not just whether handwriting matches a known sample, but the physical and chemical properties of the writing itself. The ink, the pressure of the pen strokes, the way certain inks age and change over time. Dr. Ambedkar's review of the Marsh note began as a straightforward confirmation exercise. The handwriting itself, she agreed, was very likely genuine, consistent in letter formation, spacing, and the small idiosyncrasies, a distinctive looped G, a slightly slanted T, that make handwriting difficult to forge convincingly. On that point, the original 1994 assessment appeared to hold up. But something about the ink caught her attention. Ink, it turns out, is not a static substance. Depending on its chemical composition, it undergoes gradual changes over time, a process forensic chemists refer to as ink aging, involving the evaporation of solvents and slow chemical reactions in the dye components. By analyzing these changes using a technique involving thin layer chromatography, examiners can, within a reasonable margin, estimate how long ink has been on a page relative to a known reference point. Dr. Ambedkar's analysis of the Marsh note produced a result that did not match what anyone expected. The ink aging pattern was inconsistent with a note written on the night of March 2, 1994, alongside the other known writing samples from Evelyn's desk that had been collected as part of the original investigation for comparison. Instead, the chemical signature of the ink suggested the note had been written significantly later, potentially days after Evelyn Marsh's estimated time of death, based on the original medical examiner's findings. In plain terms, according to this analysis, the note police had accepted as Evelyn Marsh's final words could not have been written by a living Evelyn Marsh on the night she died. It had been written afterward, by someone. Dr. Ambedkar's finding, once confirmed by a second independent examiner brought in specifically to verify the result, triggered what would become a full reopening of the case in 2011, 17 years after Evelyn Marsh's death. The reopening faced immediate and significant challenges. Evidence that had seemed sufficient in 1994, a note, a plausible cause of death, no signs of forced entry, now needed to be entirely re-examined in light of a discovery that fundamentally changed the timeline of what had happened in that study. If the note had been written after Evelyn's death, several possibilities emerged, each more troubling than the last. Possibility 1. Evelyn did not die on the night of March 2nd to 3rd as originally believed. The original medical examiner's estimate of time of death, based on standard methods available in 1994, body temperature, lividity, stomach contents, carried an inherent margin of error, and it was possible, though the original examiner strongly disputed this when re-interviewed in 2011, that Evelyn had in fact died somewhat later than believed, closer to when the note's ink dating suggested it was written, meaning the note could still have been written by her, just not on the night everyone assumed. Possibility 2. Evelyn was alive, but incapacitated or held somewhere for a period of days after the night her neighbor saw the study light on, and the note was written under duress, at a later date, before her actual death. Possibility 3. The note was forged after Evelyn's death by someone with access both to her house and to a level of skill sufficient to replicate her handwriting convincingly enough to fool investigators in 1994, meaning that whatever killed Evelyn on the night of March 2nd, it was not a suicide at all, and someone had staged the scene, then returned or remained afterward to plant a forged note timed to align with a different narrative entirely. Each of these possibilities was investigated by the reopened case team, led by a newly assigned detective, Marcus Del Rio, who had joined the department only a few years after the original case closed and had no connection to the original investigation. The medical examiner's original findings were reviewed by two independent forensic pathologists in 2011, both of whom concluded that while the original time of death estimate carried a wider than ideal margin of error by modern standards, it was highly unlikely that Evelyn had survived for multiple days past the estimated window, given the physical findings documented at the scene. This significantly weakened possibility 1, though it could not be entirely ruled out. Possibility 2, that Evelyn had been kept alive somewhere for a period of days, found no supporting physical evidence anywhere in the reopened investigation. No sign of restraint, no witnesses who saw her after March 2nd, no unexplained absence of the kind that would be difficult to conceal for days at a time in a household with a job, a daughter who called weekly, and a neighbor who noticed even small changes in her routine. That left possibility 3, the forgery theory, as the working hypothesis for Detective Del Rio's reopened investigation. And it is the theory that has dominated discussion of this case ever since. If the note was forged and planted after Evelyn's death, the reopened investigation needed to answer a narrower, more answerable question. Who had access to Evelyn Marsh's home, her handwriting, and her whereabouts in the days following March 2nd, 1994? This is where the case, which had seemed for 16 years to be a private tragedy with no suspects at all, suddenly acquired several. The ex-husband. Evelyn's ex-husband, Harold Marsh, had divorced her in 1989, 5 years before her death, following what both parties had described in court filings as an amicable, if painful, separation. Harold had remained in the same city, remarried in 1992, and had limited but not entirely absent contact with Evelyn afterward, largely coordinated through their adult daughter, Renata. Harold was interviewed extensively in 1994 as a matter of routine and was never considered a serious suspect at the time, given the note and the apparent absence of any evidence of a struggle. In the 2011 reopening, Harold, by then remarried and in poor health, was re-interviewed and provided an account of his whereabouts on the night of March 2nd that could not be independently verified through any surviving records, since 16 years had passed and no contemporaneous alibi documentation existed. He denied any involvement and expressed what investigators describe as genuine shock at the suggestion the note might be forged. Harold passed away in 2014 before the case reached any further resolution, and no physical evidence was ever developed connecting him to the scene. The co-worker who discovered Evelyn's body, a man named Denny Ostrovsky, who worked alongside her at the insurance company, was, in the 2011 reopening, examined more closely than he had been in 1994, largely because he was one of the only people known to have had recent direct access to samples of Evelyn's handwriting through shared work correspondence, and because his account of finding the body placed him at the scene, unaccompanied, for several minutes before he called anyone else. Denny's original 1994 statement described entering the house, finding Evelyn, and immediately calling emergency services, a timeline that, when re-examined by phone records in 2011, showed a gap of approximately 11 minutes between his estimated arrival time at the house, based on his co-workers' accounts of when he left the office and his 911 call. Denny, when re-interviewed in 2011, explained this gap as a combination of shock, checking other rooms of the house out of confusion, and difficulty finding a working phone, since Evelyn's kitchen phone was reportedly unplugged at the time. Investigators found this explanation plausible, but were unable to either confirm or refute it conclusively given the passage of time. Denny was never charged, and no forensic evidence, fingerprints, fibers, or otherwise, was ever recovered linking him to the desk, the note, or any tampering with the scene. He has maintained, in every interview given since, that he found Evelyn exactly as police found her and had no knowledge of any note beyond what he saw on the desk that morning. The unknown variable. A third and more troubling possibility raised during the reopened investigation involved the unlocked front door. Evelyn's neighbor, Constance Whitfield, had described her, in prior conversations over the years they'd lived beside one another, as someone who was almost fanatical about locking her doors. A detail that took on new weight once investigators began questioning whether someone else had been in the house after Evelyn's death. Someone who left through that door and did not lock it behind them, whether out of carelessness or because they did not have a key and could not lock it from outside. No physical evidence, fingerprints, forced entry, or otherwise, was ever recovered to identify this hypothetical third party. By 1994, standard fingerprint dusting had been conducted at the scene, but store and retrieve records from that era were incomplete, and it is unclear whether all recovered prints were ever fully cross-referenced against elimination prints for everyone with legitimate access to the home. This gap in the original 1994 processing has been cited by researchers and, later, true crime investigators as one of the case's most significant lost opportunities. If the note was forged, one obvious question hangs over the entire case. How good was the forgery? And who among the people connected to Evelyn Marsh would have had the skill to produce it? Forensic document examiners, including Dr. Ambedkar during the 2011 reopening, conducted a far more detailed handwriting comparison than had been possible in 1994, using digital overlay techniques that allowed for precise measurement of letter proportions, baseline consistency, and pen pressure variance. Details far more granular than what a general investigator could assess by eye in the original case. The results were, in Dr. Ambedkar's own characterization, unsettling in their quality. The note was not a crude forgery. Whoever produced it, if it was indeed a forgery, had access to genuine samples of Evelyn's handwriting extensive enough to replicate not just the general shape of her letters, but subtle habitual features that are notoriously difficult to fake convincingly, including her specific way of crossing certain letters and a slight rightward slant that increased toward the end of longer words, a fatigue pattern common in genuine handwriting that forgers frequently fail to replicate. This level of quality suggested, to several of the examiners consulted, either someone who had studied Evelyn's handwriting closely over an extended period, a family member, a close co-worker, someone with routine access to her handwritten notes and correspondence, or, more unsettlingly, someone with professional-level forgery training. A possibility that opened an entirely different and far darker line of inquiry that Detective Del Rio's team was never able to substantiate with any concrete evidence. No expert forger was ever identified or connected to the case. No confession, no admission, no witness ever came forward with knowledge of the note's true origin. The forgery theory, however strongly supported by the ink-aging analysis, has remained a theory, persuasive, but never proven to the standard required to reopen the case as an active homicide investigation with a named suspect. It's worth pausing here to say clearly, not everyone who has studied this case accepts the forgery theory, even with the ink aging evidence in hand. A minority of forensic experts consulted over the years, including, notably, a retired document examiner who reviewed the case independently for a legal journal in 2016, have raised legitimate questions about the reliability of ink aging analysis performed on a document that had been stored for 16 years in varying conditions before Dr. Ambedkar's 2010 review. Ink aging techniques, while scientifically established, are sensitive to storage conditions, humidity, light exposure, temperature, and some experts have argued that improper storage of the original case file over more than a decade could have introduced enough variability to produce a misleading result, without necessarily meaning the note was written after Evelyn's death at all. Dr. Ambedkar and the independent examiner who verified her original finding have both maintained, in subsequent statements, that they accounted for storage-related variables in their analysis, and stand by the conclusion that the ink dating is inconsistent with a note written on the night of March 2, 1994. But the disagreement among experts has never been fully resolved, and it remains one of the more contentious aspects of the case among those who follow it closely. This is, in many ways, the central frustration of the entire story, a piece of evidence significant enough to overturn a 16-year-old ruling, but not quite definitive enough to produce a new one. Throughout the 2011 reopening and in the years since, Evelyn's daughter Renata, by then in her 40s, with children of her own, became the case's most persistent advocate, pushing for continued investigation long after the department's active resources had moved on to newer cases. Renata has spoken publicly in interviews given over the past decade about the strange relief and renewed grief the 2010 discovery brought her in equal measure. Relief that her lifelong instinct that something about her mother's death had never added up had finally been validated by science. Grief that the validation came with no answers attached, only a deeper and more painful mystery than the one she'd lived with for 16 years. I spent 16 years being told I was in denial, Renata said in a 2019 interview. That grief makes people look for explanations that aren't there. And then someone finally looked at the actual evidence with the right tools, and it turned out I wasn't in denial. I was right. And somehow that's worse, in a way, because now I know something happened to her that we still can't explain, and I don't know if we ever will. Renata has continued to push for renewed forensic review of the case as techniques improve, including advocating for updated fingerprint database cross-referencing and, more recently, for a full re-examination of any physical evidence still retained in the case file using modern trace and touch DNA analysis, techniques that did not exist in any practical form in 1994, and that were not part of the standard forensic toolkit even during the 2011 reopening. As of this telling, portions of that re-examination are reportedly underway, though the department has not released a timeline for when or whether new results might be announced. More than 30 years after Evelyn Marsh's death, and over a decade after the discovery that appended the official account of what happened to her, the case remains formally classified as an undetermined death rather than a confirmed homicide, a designation that reflects the genuine, unresolved uncertainty at the center of the case. The note exists. Its ink dating remains contested but unrefuted. No suspect has ever been charged. No confession has ever been made. What is clear is this: for 16 years, a family, a police department, and an entire community believed they understood exactly what had happened on the night of March 2nd, 1994. A single piece of paper, examined by the right person, using a technique that didn't even exist as standard practice when the case was first closed, was enough to unravel that certainty entirely and replace it with a mystery that, in some ways, is harder to sit with than the original tragedy ever was. Because a suicide, however painful, is at least an ending. A story with a beginning, middle, and a terrible final period at the end of the sentence. What this case leaves behind, instead, is a story with no ending at all. A note that says one thing, but that the evidence says was written by someone, at some point, under some circumstances that no one has ever been able to fully explain. Somewhere, if this case is what many now believe it to be, someone has carried the truth about that note for over 30 years. Maybe they were young when it happened, and time has made the weight of it feel smaller, more distant, easier to justify not saying anything about. Maybe they've told themselves, the way people often do, that there's no point coming forward now, that too much time has passed, that no one would believe them anyway. But cases like this one are proof that time doesn't erase evidence the way people assume it does. A piece of paper sat quietly in a file cabinet for 16 years, and it still had something to say. It just took the right person, with the right tools, finally taking the time to listen to it. If anything in this story feels familiar to you, a name, a detail, a story you were told growing up that never quite made sense, the detectives working this case, even now, would want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments what you think really happened in that study on the night of March 2nd, 1994. Do you believe the ink? Do you think there's a more ordinary explanation still hiding in this file? Or do you think, like Renata does, that someone out there has known the truth all along? If you want more cases like this one, make sure you're subscribed to Shelby's Den and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Until next time, stay curious and take care of each other.